What's up guys, I'm Brad Rodriguez from Fix This Build That, and today I'm going to show you how to make a space-saving parallel clamp rack. It'll hold up to 36 parallel clamps or a variety of other long clamps like the one I have up here that I made for myself. But this one is going to go to a special place in the JET and Powermatic training facility. I'll show you exactly how to make the clamp rack, and I'm going to give you a sneak peek at the facility. Let's take a look.
I started the project with a full sheet of plywood, and I cut it in half with my circular saw, using a few pieces of rigid foam insulation for support. This is a quick and easy way to break down sheet goods outside of the shop. To get all the pieces out of the half sheet of plywood, I had to be pretty precise with the layout, and cutting everything in the right order is really important. I cut 2 long strips off for the top and the back, and then I used my crosscut sled to cut the parts to length. The offcut from this piece will be used later for clamp supports. I cut a piece off the bottom of the remaining plywood for the sides of the rack, and I cut it to width, but I left it a little long for the next step. To get the 2 sides, I laid out an angle across the piece to establish one of the parts, then I used a T-bevel to set up the same angle between my miter gauge and the blade. I clamped a stop block on the auxiliary fence of my miter gauge, and I made that first cut on the layout line. Then I registered the longer offcut against the stop block and cut the second piece to size. If you have limited infeed or a smaller table saw, I'd recommend that you make this cut with a jigsaw or a bandsaw. The pointed ends of the sides needed to be cut flush, so I laid the back and the top out how they'd be assembled, and then I marked and cut those little nubbins off on the miter saw. With the sides and the backs cut to size, I moved on to the clamp supports. I ripped a series of parts to make the horizontal supports for the clamps and a strip for the 2 cleats. The supports on the outside of the rack will be attached to mounting cleats on the sides. I cut the cleats to size, leaving room for the back panel, and then I attached one to each side. I tacked them in place with a nailer, and then I secured them with 3 screws to each side. With both cleats attached, I rounded the front corner of each side piece to soften the sharp edges. Next I moved on to the horizontal clamp supports. I cut a small piece for the left side of the rack, 5 full width pieces for the center supports, and a piece for the right side that's slightly smaller than full width. To make it easier to get the clamps in the rack, I wanted to round the front corners of the supports. I used a 1/4-inch washer, and I marked a small radius on those corners. To make the sanding a little faster, I taped the inner supports together in a stack of 2 and a stack of 3 supports. You can also round these with a palm sander or a disc sander just as easily. The last piece before assembly is to make the triangle brackets to hold the clamp supports. I grabbed that last piece of plywood from the half sheet, and I cut it into 3 sections a little longer than I needed. I laid out the size triangle I wanted on the top piece, and then I taped all 3 pieces together. The parts were too small to comfortably cut on the table saw, so I cut them on the bandsaw here. I added a little more tape to keep each stack together, and then I sanded the rough cut edges smooth on the sander. I was left with 1 stack of 3 8x10-inch triangle brackets and a stack with 3 oversized ones. Using one of the good brackets as reference, I set a stop block on my crosscut sled and cut the other 3 to size. I'm actually only going to use 5 of these, but I went ahead and cut the 6th one just as an extra. Next I put together the clamp support assemblies. I started by attaching the left and right edge supports to the sides. I used glue and 3 screws per support just like the cleats. To prep the inner supports, I drilled pocket holes on the top side of each of them, and then I marked the location for 3 screws down the side. To assemble the inner supports, I put glue on the long edge of a triangle bracket and then centered it on the horizontal support. I used a combination square to center the bracket and a right angle on the other side to make sure that the bracket was standing up straight. I tacked the pieces in place with a nailer, and then I secured them by pre-drilling and screwing the horizontal support down to the locations I marked earlier. I repeated this 4 more times, and I had all my inner supports ready.
Just got finished doing all the parts. I'm about to start assembly, but I just wanted to show you real quick. If you wanted to hang pipe clamps or bar clamps or any other type of clamp, you could just adjust the size of this top support here, and that'll allow you to get a lot more in because you don't need this full width if you're using something with a smaller clamping head. There's a link down below in the description to the plans for this as well as the plans to the one that I built before. So you can go check that out and modify it so that it'll fit what you need if this isn't what's going to work for you. All right, I'm going to get to assembly now.
Assembly is pretty straightforward. I started by attaching the sides to the back with pocket screws, and I shimmed the back up off the table with a few scraps to leave room for the top. I flipped the assembly on its back, and then I brought over the inner supports. The reason I didn't attach the top was so I could use it to reference against the outer supports and then have something to butt those inner supports up against as I attach them. To get consistent spacing between the supports, I cut 6 little spacer blocks to size. Had to do a little finagling with these to get them just right, but it worked out really well to have them. To attach the supports, I put glue on the back of each one, and then I lined the support with the spacer block and the top, and then I secured them with pocket screws. Now these parallel clamps are pretty heavy, so I wanted to put 3 screws in from the back into each triangular bracket as well. I flipped the rack over again, and I used a combination square to mark for the 3 screws on the center of each bracket. After the brackets were marked, I pre-drilled and I drove the screws into each bracket. It would have been more efficient to pre-drill all the holes and then put all the screws in at one time, but I was really a little overly concerned about that glue drying, so I started with the first support and then just worked my way down. With the supports in place, the last thing to do was to attach the top. I slid it into place and then I pre-drilled and attached screws into the back. Then I clamped the top flush to the sides using a right angle clamp and secured the top to each side with pocket screws. With the rack finished, it was time to hit the road. The JET and Powermatic training facility is just about 30 minutes east of my house in Laverne, Tennessee. The shop is loaded with almost every woodworking tool you can imagine here. The Powermatic tools are on one side, including their new full-size CNC, and the other side has complementary JET tools with many of their new designs as well. It's a great place where they can teach distributors and employees about their tools, and man, was it awesome to visit.
All right, guys, you guys all have this many clamps in your shop, right? Well, here at JET Powermatic, they do, and so they need a lot of storage for their clamps. We're going to throw them up there. We've got 36 parallel clamps. These guys know how to do it right at JET. They've got a lot of clamps. So we're going to put them up there, and I'll show you just how much this rack will hold. I want to give a huge shout out to JET Woodworking for having me out to the training facility and partnering with me on building this clamp rack. I'm looking forward to doing some more projects with them throughout the year, so be on the lookout for that. If you want plans to build your own clamp rack, there's a link down below in the description. If you like the video, go ahead and hit that like. I would love to have you subscribe if you're not already. And until next time, guys, get out there and build something awesome.